A man walks into a room he was never supposed to enter. He sits down across from a country that just weeks earlier had looked him in the eye and promised to protect him. And then he is told, in the most formal, precise, and carefully chosen language that diplomacy allows, that his country made a catastrophic mistake. That is what happened on Sunday, March 1st, 2026, when Saudi Arabia summoned Iranian Ambassador Alireza Enayati into the foreign ministry in Riyadh. And what happened inside that room is only the very surface of a story that goes much, much deeper than a single meeting between two officials. Because behind that one diplomatic summoning lies one of the most explosive 48 hours the Middle East has ever witnessed. A 48 hours that began with nuclear talks and the scent of peace, moved through a betrayal nobody saw coming, exploded into the largest military operation the region had seen in decades, and ended with the most powerful country in the Arab world, staring at smoke rising over its own capital, from missiles that should never, under any circumstances, have been aimed at it in the first place. This is not just a story about a summoned ambassador. This is a story about a supreme leader who died, about a promise that was broken, about a region that shook from Riyadh to Tel Aviv, from Doha to Abu Dhabi, from Manama to Kuwait City, all at the same time. This is the story of how a diplomatic guarantee became a lie in the sky over Riyadh, and why what happened on Sunday will reshape the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran for years to come. So let us go back. Let us go all the way back to where this truly started, because to understand Sunday, you must understand Saturday. And to understand Saturday, you have to understand the months that came before it. For nearly 2 years, Iran and the United States had been circling each other in a careful, dangerous, exhausting dance. Diplomats were flying. Messages were being carried back and forth through neutral countries. Oman, the quiet, careful, perpetually neutral sultanate at the edge of the Arabian Sea, had positioned itself as the key mediator, running messages between Washington and Tehran, trying to find the narrow path between nuclear disaster and military confrontation. The core of the dispute was Iran's nuclear program. Iran had been enriching uranium to levels that alarmed the entire international community. And then, something remarkable appeared to happen. On February 27, 2026, Oman's Foreign Minister Badr al-Busaidi made a statement that gave the world real hope. He said that Iran had agreed, during the most recent round of talks in Geneva, to degrade its nuclear stockpiles to the lowest possible level, effectively down to unrefined material, removing the immediate path toward a weapon. He described the development as a major breakthrough. He said peace was within reach. For a single, brief, shining moment, it genuinely looked like the crisis was going to end at a negotiating table instead of in a fireball. That moment lasted less than 24 hours, because while diplomats were still processing the news from Geneva, something else had already been set in motion, something planned for months, something that had been waiting for exactly the right conditions. Israeli and American intelligence services had spent a long time tracking the movements of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the 86-year-old man who had ruled Iran for nearly 4 decades. The man who had built the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps into one of the most feared military institutions in the entire region. The man who had spent his career funding Hezbollah, arming Hamas, directing the Houthis in Yemen, and maintaining a network of proxies stretching across the Middle East and beyond. They had been watching him, studying his routines, waiting for the moment when conditions aligned perfectly. On Saturday, February 28, 2026, they decided the moment had arrived. At 9:45 in the morning, Tehran time, the skies above Iran filled with a sound that no city ever wants to hear. The United States and Israel launched a coordinated, massive, and completely unprecedented joint military strike on Iran. Israel called it Operation Roaring Lion. The Pentagon called it Operation Epic Fury. They hit nuclear-related infrastructure. They killed dozens and then hundreds of senior military commanders and IRGC officials. And they struck the compound of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei himself, a heavily secured complex in the Pasteur district of Tehran that housed his residence, his office, and the adjacent offices of the Iranian Presidency and National Security Council. The images that emerged in those first hours were staggering. Satellite photographs showed Khamenei's compound obliterated, reduced to a field of rubble and smoke. Black plumes rose over Tehran's skyline and could be seen from miles away. The city went into immediate lockdown. Iran's Supreme National Security Council instructed the residents of Tehran and all other major Iranian cities to shelter in place in the most protected locations available. Flights were canceled. Roads were jammed with traffic as people tried to flee. The world held its breath. Within hours, Trump posted on Truth Social. The message was blunt, deliberate, and designed to be impossible to ignore. He wrote that Khamenei, whom he called one of the most evil people in history, was dead. He said that the people who make all the decisions in Iran, most of them were gone. He said that the heavy and precise bombing would continue without interruption throughout the week, or as long as necessary, to achieve his stated objective of peace throughout the Middle East and the world. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu confirmed the strikes. said the goal was to remove the existential threat posed by the Iranian regime and urged the brave Iranian people to take their destiny into their own hands. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, initially told NBC News that Khamenei was alive as far as he knew, but within hours, the truth could no longer be denied. Iranian state media confirmed it. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran for 35 years, was dead, killed at his workplace, killed while, according to Iranian state news, carrying out his duties at his desk in the Beit Rabari, his official compound. Iran declared 40 days of national mourning. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian declared Khamenei a martyr, praised his 37 years of leadership, and made a vow that would echo across the entire region. Those responsible for this would be made to regret it. Bloodshed and revenge, he said, were Iran's legitimate right and duty. And when he said revenge, he meant it within hours. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps announced what it called the most intense offensive operation in the history of the armed forces of the Islamic Republic. Dozens of ballistic missiles and drones began launching from Iranian territory, arcing over the Persian Gulf and beyond. They were aimed at American military bases. They were aimed at Israel. And they were aimed at every Arab country in the region that hosted U.S. military forces, regardless of whether those countries had asked for any of this. Bahrain was hit first. Air raid sirens screamed across the capital, Manama. The U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet Headquarters, one of America's most important naval commands in the world, was targeted directly. Explosions shook the small island nation. Kuwait was next. Iranian missiles targeted the Ali al-Salem Air Base, a facility that also housed Italian soldiers serving alongside Americans. Explosions rocked areas near Kuwait International Airport. Qatar felt the earth move as Iran fired an astounding 65 missiles and 12 drones toward the Al Udeid Air Base, the largest American military installation in the entire Middle East, home to roughly 10,000 U.S. troops and the forward headquarters of U.S. Central Command. Qatar's Patriot air defense systems went to work, intercepting most of the incoming projectiles, but 8 people were still injured, one of them critically. The United Arab Emirates was struck too. Residents in Abu Dhabi reported multiple massive explosions near Al Dhafra, Al Bateen, and along the Corniche. One civilian in the UAE was killed. Property damage was widespread. Jordan was hit. A Bundeswehr camp in the eastern part of the country was struck by Iranian missiles, injuring 1 German soldier. Iraq was targeted. American bases near Erbil in the Kurdistan region came under attack from both direct Iranian missiles and drones launched by Iran-aligned Iraqi militias, which declared they had carried out 16 separate operations in that single day alone. And then Iran aimed at Saudi Arabia. This is the moment where the story becomes something far beyond a military conflict. Because what Iran did to Saudi Arabia was not only a military act, it was a personal, deliberate, and profound betrayal of the highest diplomatic order. Return to January 14th, 2026. Saudi Arabia, you fully aware that the United States was building military pressure against Iran and that some kind of confrontation was becoming increasingly possible, made a decision. It sent a message directly to Tehran, not through intermediaries, not through a press release, directly through official diplomatic channels. Saudi Arabia told Iran's government that it would not allow its territory or its airspace to be used for any military action against Iran, from any party, for any reason. 2 sources close to the Saudi government confirmed this message to AFP at the time. The message was unambiguous. Saudi Arabia was staying out of this. Saudi Arabia was not your enemy. Saudi Arabia was, in a meaningful sense, trying to protect you. Then go to January 28th, 2026. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman personally picked up the phone and called Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian. The call was initiated by Pezeshkian himself, suggesting Iran wanted the reassurance. And on that call, MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia and one of the most powerful men in the Arab world, reaffirmed the kingdom's position in the most personal and direct terms imaginable. He told Iran's president that Saudi Arabia would not allow the use of its airspace or territory in any military actions against Iran or any attacks by any party, regardless of their destination. He did not leave any room for ambiguity. This was not diplomatic boilerplate. This was a personal guarantee from one leader to another, and the Gulf Cooperation Council added its own layer of assurance. The GCC Secretary General conveyed to Iran that none of the GCC's 6 member states, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, the UAE, or Oman, would permit their territory or airspace to be used for military operations against Iran. The entire Arabian Peninsula effectively had told Iran, "You are safe from us." Saudi Arabia had done everything a neutral country can do. It had warned Washington. It had guaranteed Tehran. It had tried to navigate the sharpest and most dangerous fine line in the region, maintaining its alliance with America while not becoming a magnet for Iranian fury. Saudi Arabia had walked that line with precision and care for months. And then February 28th arrived. And Iran fired at Saudi Arabia anyway. Iranian ballistic missiles targeted Prince Sultan Air Base, located roughly 60 kilometers south of Riyadh. This is not an insignificant installation. Prince Sultan Air Base is one of the most strategically vital military facilities in the entire region. It houses American soldiers. It holds Patriot missile batteries. It is equipped with the THAAD missile defense system. At the time the strikes began, the base reportedly held 24 F-16 fighter jets, 6 E-3 aircraft, 5 E-11A air communication relay hubs, more than a dozen KC-135 aerial refueling tankers, and several P-8A maritime patrol aircraft. The Americans had been using it as part of their operational posture for the entire period leading up to the Iran strikes. Iran knew every one of these details. Iran knew exactly what that base was and who was in it. Iran also fired at King Khalid International Airport in Riyadh. Not a military base, a civilian airport, the kind of airport where ordinary families arrive to reunite, where workers land after long journeys, where students come home for holidays, where business travelers rush through terminals with coffee and briefcases. Eyewitnesses near the airport reported hearing the sharp, violent crack of air defense systems activating in the sky directly above them. One witness said they saw and heard the air defense intercept the missile overhead. Explosions rumbled across eastern Riyadh. Smoke rose from the direction of the Prince Sultan base. Saudi authorities immediately activated nationwide air defense protocols and told all civilians and military personnel to exercise maximum caution. The kingdom was under attack. Saudi Arabia's air defenses held. The interceptors worked. The airport survived. The base survived. There were no confirmed Saudi casualties from the direct Iranian strikes on Riyadh that day. But that fact, however fortunate, is almost beside the point. Because what Iran had done in firing at Saudi soil after all the promises and guarantees was not simply a military provocation. It was Iran telling Saudi Arabia, in the most direct and physical language possible, that no promise it made to Riyadh would stop it from treating Saudi territory as a legitimate target the moment Iran decided it needed to. Saudi Arabia was furious. Multiple Gulf Arab sources told Middle East Eye that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman expressed deep anger at the scale and timing of the entire operation, and at what it now meant for Saudi Arabia's exposure and its position in the region. Senior Saudi officials were described to reporters as being infuriated. The Saudi Foreign Ministry released a statement calling Iran's strikes on Riyadh and the eastern province blatant and cowardly attacks. And it emphasized, in language that was selected with extreme deliberate care, that these attacks had come despite Iran's full awareness that Saudi Arabia had confirmed it would not allow its airspace or territory to be used to target Iran. That phrase was not an accident. That was Saudi Arabia telling the world and telling Iran directly and unmistakably, "We kept our word. You broke yours." CNN reported another dimension of this that makes the picture even more complicated. According to CNN's reporting, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, with the backing of the United States, vowed to employ military force against any further Iranian incursions into Saudi territory. He called the Iranian strikes cowardly specifically because they had targeted a country that had closed its airspace to U.S. and Israeli attackers. Saudi Arabia had bent over backward to stay neutral. Iran had targeted it regardless. And then the Washington Post revealed something that adds an entirely different and deeply complex layer to the entire story. 4 sources familiar with the matter told the Post that the decision to launch Saturday's massive strike on Iran had come in part after weeks of private lobbying by an unusual coalition, Israel and Saudi Arabia working together. Saudi Arabia, the same country that had publicly guaranteed Iran it would stay out, had reportedly been privately urging Washington to act. Saudi Arabia had, according to these accounts, given quiet, behind-closed-doors acquiescence to the operation, even as it was publicly guaranteeing Iran that it would not be involved. This is the kind of painful, complicated, layered contradiction that defines how power actually works in the Middle East. A country can simultaneously promise not to be involved and privately want the operation to succeed. A country can guarantee your safety in public while hoping that the threat against its own security is removed by others. These things can be true at the same time. The Middle East is full of precisely these kinds of impossible positions, and Saudi Arabia has been forced to occupy them more than most. But even accounting for all of that complexity, even accepting that Saudi Arabia may have wanted Iran's military power degraded, even understanding the quiet games being played behind closed doors, nothing that was happening in private makes what Iran did to Saudi soil defensible in the context of the explicit, personal, direct guarantees that had been given. Iran knew the promises. Iran received those promises. Iran fired anyway. So on Sunday, March 1st, 2026, Saudi Arabia summoned Ambassador Alireza Inayati. Deputy Foreign Minister Walid bin Abdulkarim al-Khuraiji met with him and delivered the kingdom's formal position without softening a single word. He conveyed Saudi Arabia's strong condemnation and denunciation of the attacks on the kingdom and on neighboring Gulf states. He He reaffirmed Saudi Arabia's categorical rejection of violations of state sovereignty that undermine regional security and stability. He stressed that Iran's targeting of civilian facilities, including a major international airport, was a serious breach of international law and a violation of both the United Nations Charter and the fundamental principles of good neighborliness between nations. And he warned in terms that were careful but unmistakable that Saudi Arabia would take all necessary measures to defend its security and protect its territory, its citizens, and its residents, including, the official statement made clear, the option of responding to the aggression militarily. That last phrase was not routine language, including the option of responding to the aggression. That is, Saudi Arabia, a country that had spent years carefully rebuilding a relationship with Iran after a long period of severed ties, now putting military response explicitly on the table that changes the temperature of the entire diplomatic relationship in ways that will be felt for a long time. Saudi Arabia was not alone in this response. Kuwait summoned Iran's ambassador to deliver a nearly identical message. Qatar's foreign ministry released a fierce and pointed condemnation, calling Iran's strikes a violation of Qatari sovereignty and reaffirming Qatar's right to respond. The UAE's Ministry of Foreign Affairs described the attacks as a flagrant violation of its national sovereignty. The UAE's presidential advisor, Anwar Gargash, was particularly blunt. He said Iran had made a miscalculation, that the Gulf states were innocent bystanders in a war they had not chosen, and delivered a message directly to Tehran: your war is not with your neighbors. The Gulf Cooperation Council convened an emergency video conference that day to coordinate a unified regional response. The GCC Secretary General condemned the attacks and issued full solidarity to every member state that had been struck. France's Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot said the Gulf states had been dragged into a war they did not choose, and expressed France's unequivocal condemnation and full support. Germany's Chancellor Friedrich Merz called on Iran to immediately stop its attacks and said the country was heading into an uncertain future. Oman's Foreign Minister al-Busaidi, the man who had spent the better part of a year building the nuclear agreement that could have prevented all of this, called Iran directly and urged a ceasefire. The sense of dismay in every word he used was palpable to anyone reading or hearing it. Meanwhile, the conflict was still expanding around them. The IRGC announced that 4 major U.S. bases had been struck: Al Udeid in Qatar, Ali al-Salam in Kuwait, Al Dhafra in the UAE, and the 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain. An American radar station in Qatar, an AN/FPS-132 Block 5 missile warning system, was reportedly destroyed by a direct Iranian strike. 3 members of the United States military were killed, 5 others were wounded. The Pentagon confirmed the deaths and stated that major combat operations were ongoing. In Israel, Iranian strikes caused devastation of a more personal and human kind. A missile struck a synagogue and destroyed a bomb shelter in the city of Beit Shemesh. 9 people were killed, including a woman and her mother and a 16-year-old boy. In Tel Aviv, a missile hit a residential building. A woman was killed. More than 120 people were injured across multiple sites throughout the country. Air raid sirens sounded across Israel for hours on end. Hundreds of thousands of Israelis rushed to bomb shelters. El Al suspended ticket sales indefinitely and began coordinating a recovery operation to bring stranded Israeli travelers home from abroad. Over 1,400 flights across the Middle East were canceled. Dubai International Airport, the busiest international airport in the world, was shut down. Passengers sat stranded in parking lots waiting for guidance that could not be provided. Global shipping companies began suspending their Gulf transits due to security concerns. Marine insurance firms started canceling or sharply repricing policies for the entire Middle East region. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow 33-kilometer-wide waterway through which roughly 20% of the world's daily oil supply flows, faced disruption unlike anything seen in modern times. 2 vessels were struck by projectiles in a single day. An oil tanker was targeted off the coast of Oman. The global economy, already watching with fear and calculating worst-case scenarios, began to feel the first tremors of a crisis that could spread far beyond the Gulf. And through all of this, Iran kept firing. On March 1st, the same day Saudi Arabia summoned the ambassador, Iran launched a second full day of strikes. More ballistic missiles, more drones. More explosions echoing over the cities of the Gulf and over Israel. The IRGC declared that all American and Israeli military targets throughout the Middle East had been struck, and that operations would continue relentlessly until the enemy was decisively defeated. Iran's new acting leadership, with Khamenei dead, power had temporarily transferred to a 3-member council, made its position completely clear. There would be no pause. There would be no ceasefire. The blood of the supreme leader demanded vengeance. Senior clerics issued fatwas calling it the religious duty of all Muslims worldwide to avenge Khamenei's death. The language was the most mobilizing, most urgent language that Shia Islamic jurisprudence permits. This was not political posturing. This was an instruction to every Iran-aligned force, from Lebanese Hezbollah to Iraqi militias to Yemeni Houthis, to understand that the war had entered a new phase. And yet, in one of the most striking contradictions of this entire story, parts of Iran itself were celebrating. In Galadar and Fars province, people tore down monuments honoring Khamenei in scenes of public celebration. In Los Angeles, home to more than 200,000 Iranians and the largest Iranian diaspora outside of Iran, crowds poured into the streets waving pre-revolution Iranian flags, the flags of a country that existed before the Islamic Republic was born. Restaurant owners who had fled Iran decades ago cried in public. Reza Pahlavi, the exiled crown prince, called Khamenei a bloodthirsty despot and said he had been erased from the face of history. The image of grief inside Iran and celebration outside it told a story of a population deeply and irreconcilably divided about the regime that had ruled it for 47 years. Back in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia was now forced to reckon with an extremely uncomfortable strategic reality. It had tried to stay neutral. Its air defenses had performed well. No Saudis had died in the direct Iranian strikes on the capital. But Saudi Arabia had still been targeted, deliberately, knowingly targeted, after giving every assurance possible that it should not be. And that changes the fundamental calculation of how Saudi Arabia must now think about Iran going forward. Because here is the question that sits at the heart of all of this. If a country can give a personal, direct, explicit diplomatic guarantee to another country, delivered through official channels, confirmed through a phone call between Crown Prince and President, and still end up with missiles aimed at its capital airport, then what is the value of any diplomatic guarantee at all? What is the purpose of the careful relationship building, the back-channel conversations, the formal assurances, the GCC Secretary General's written commitments? If all of that can be swept aside the moment one country decides it is in enough pain to fire at everything in range, then the entire architecture of Gulf diplomacy has a crack running through its foundation. That is the deeper wound that the summoning of Ambassador Enayati was trying to address. Not the missiles themselves, Saudi defenses handled those, but the meaning of the missiles, the message they sent about what Saudi Arabia's guarantees are worth to Iran when Iran is pushed to its absolute limit. And yet, even now, even furious, Saudi Arabia has not escalated beyond the diplomatic condemnation. Middle East Eye reported that Saudi officials were privately telling Gulf allies to avoid any steps that could inflame tensions further. Saudi Arabia, even while delivering its sharpest formal condemnation in years, was simultaneously trying to act as a brake on further escalation. It was playing, as it almost always does, multiple sides of the board at the same time, condemning Iran loudly in public while quietly urging restraint, so the fire does not spread to a size that no one can control. This is the Saudi Arabia that the world rarely sees clearly, the Saudi Arabia that expresses fury and caution in the same breath, the Saudi Arabia that can publicly guarantee Iran's safety, while reportedly lobbying Washington to degrade Iran's military, the Saudi Arabia that gets targeted, despite its promises, and still tries to prevent the region from collapsing completely. It is a country that has survived and grown powerful in one of the world's most volatile neighborhoods precisely because it plays this kind of complicated, multidimensional game better than almost anyone else. The summoning of Ambassador Enayati was, in the end, Saudi Arabia doing several things at once. It was a formal act of condemnation entered into the permanent diplomatic record. It was a warning that Saudi Arabia would not absorb further strikes without a military response. It was a signal to Washington that Riyadh had been pushed far beyond what it signed up for, and that the U.S. needed to factor Saudi Arabia's exposure and limits into its ongoing calculations. And it was a unified message to the Gulf and to the broader Arab world that Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, and the UAE were standing together, that no Gulf state would accept Iranian strikes on its territory as a price worth paying for someone else's war. What comes next is genuinely and deeply unknown. Iran's supreme leader is dead. The process for selecting his successor, a responsibility given to Iran's 88-member assembly of experts, has begun, but these things take time. And in the absence of clear leadership, the most extreme voices in the IRGC are the loudest ones in the room. Trump has said the strikes will continue through the week. Netanyahu has confirmed Israel will continue operating with full force inside Iran. 3 American soldiers are dead. More than 100 children were reportedly killed in a strike on a school near a military base in southern Iran, adding a dimension of civilian tragedy that will fuel outrage for a long time to come. The Strait of Hormuz is under threat. Global oil markets are watching every hour. The world's airlines are rerouting around an entire region that is turned into a war zone from the air. And in a room in Riyadh on Sunday, March 1st, 2026, a man named Ali Reza Enayati sat across from Saudi Arabia's deputy foreign minister and listened. He listened to a list of broken promises. He listened to a formal and official warning. He had no satisfactory answers to give. His country had fired at a country that had protected it. Saudi Arabia had intercepted those missiles. And now the two nations, which had invested years of careful, painful diplomacy in rebuilding a relationship, sat on opposite sides of a table in one of the most consequential moments their relationship has ever faced. The real reason Saudi Arabia summoned the Iranian ambassador today was not simply the missiles. The missiles were the trigger. The real reason was everything those missiles represented. They represented the collapse of a diplomatic framework that had been built carefully, year after year, through calls and meetings and personal guarantees. They represented the recognition that in a region engulfed by war, being near American power makes you a target, even if you spent months trying not to be one. They represented the moment when Iran, in its deepest pain and fury, looked at every promise it had received and decided none of them mattered enough. And they represented the beginning of something none of the analysts, none of the diplomats, none of the intelligence officials, and none of the leaders across the Gulf can yet define with certainty. Something new, something unstable, something whose shape will only become clear in the weeks and months ahead. What is clear right now is this. Saudi Arabia tried to stay out of it. Saudi Arabia gave its word. Saudi Arabia kept its airspace closed. Saudi Arabia was targeted anyway. That is why the ambassador was summoned. That is the real reason. And that is the detail, not the military one, not the tactical one, but the diplomatic and human one that will define the relationship between these two nations and the future of the Gulf for a very long time to come.